Well, we're back from our hike and ready to go inside and show you guys around our cute little distillery here in Purcellville, Virginia. This is Main Street and very busy little street here, and our distillery sits prominently right on it. So why don't we go on inside and show you around. Before we start the tour here today, I want to introduce you to my business partner and my wife, Becky Harris. Becky is our chief distiller, and she is the person responsible for this enterprise, responsible for making all the whiskey and making sure that it happens every single day. So we're incredibly proud of her, and thank you, Becky, for doing all of what you do to make this beautiful, beautiful spirit.
Glad to see you all here. Thank you.
All right, greetings, everybody. Again, my name is Scott Harris with Catoctin Creek Distillery, and I'm going to give you a tour of the distillery. Here I am inside the distillery on a busy production day, so there might be some noise in the background as we work through the distillery here. But if you'll follow me, I'll start with the tour. So, we'll start right over here first. And right behind me there, over my shoulder, is our mash tank. And in that tank, we produce every day a rye mash. We fill it up with 300 gallons of water, and then we introduce into it about 700 pounds of our locally sourced organic rye. That rye, of course, then will mix with the water, creating basically a stiff porridge. That porridge then will cook for a number of hours as we start to break down the starches in there into simple sugars. As it does that, those simple sugars become available. That's the sugar, of course, that we're going to need for yeast to ferment into alcohol, developing all that beautiful flavor then from that grain. We use a complicated mash bill, actually, of multiple different ryes from around different parts of the Commonwealth of Virginia. That gives us a complexity of flavor, some of that rye tasting quite sweet, and some of it tasting more spicy and having more backbone to it. Together, they produce a more complex flavor than a single strain of rye would do on its own. So we'll take a peek in here, and we can see the rye mesh going right around there. Just a big, thick porridge, quite noisy actually. I wish you could smell it. The smell of the rye mash is actually quite amazing. So behind us here we have the fermenters. There's 6 fermenters, which means we can do 6 batches per week, and we will pump each mash into one of those fermenters where it will begin to become alcoholic. We've got roughly 300 gallons of mash in there, and at roughly 10% alcohol, which it'll become, that means there'll be eventually 30 gallons of liquor hiding in every one of those mashes that we have to get out through distillation. Now, while it's fermenting in there, it's essentially turning into beer. This is a beer that is unlike the beer that you might drink. The first major difference is that it has all of the chunks of grain still in there. So it still resembles that porridge. We often call it, jokingly, a beer smoothie here, but don't recommend drinking it. It is quite high in fiber and really tough on the gut. The second major difference in it from a normal beer is that we don't use any hops. Hops is a flavoring in beer that we don't use in whiskey. It's not allowed, actually, so we don't use any hops whatsoever in our whiskey. And the third major difference is the yeast. So in yeast terminology, we're using something much more like a champagne yeast than we are a brewer's yeast. That's going to give us a full, complete dry fermentation, getting us up to that full about 10% alcohol, as I mentioned, in the 300 gallons of liquor, or 300 gallons of mash that we're producing. Now, once we have the mash fully fermented into the fermenters, after about 7 days, then it's time to introduce it into one of the 2 stills behind me here. Now, over this shoulder here is Barney, our smaller still. He was our original first piece of equipment when we started the distillery way back in 2009. And today, Barney is our auxiliary still. So we use him for making gin, for making brandy, for redistilling tails, and all kinds of auxiliary functions like that. On my other shoulder here is Ron. Ron is our full-time whiskey still. So 300 gallon capacity, we will load the entire vessel of fermenter into Ron, at which time we start to distill it. So as we distill in Ron, we will load the mash right in through the manhole here, and it'll begin to boil. This entire silver part at the bottom is a steam jacket that is used to heat up the mash, and it can heat up the mash quite quickly. Now, the major difference in our pot still is that we're using a hybrid pot column still here, taking advantage of some German technology. So inside this column are several plates, And those little levers allow us to tune the plates as we wish. The major innovation of that is that we don't have to do a 2-run distillation like they do in Scotland. We can go from mash to finished spirit in 1 run. And that's just a time-saving device here. We're still getting the benefit of a full, complete 9-hour distillation in the pot still. And just like in Scotland, we'll get a full, complete heads, hearts, and tails of the distillation that we do. As we distill, the vapors start to boil and turn into steam as they rise up through the column here. They will ascend the column, rectifying, getting purer, at which point they'll pass into the line arm, which is the tube at the top of the distillery, and then down into the condenser, the silver tube behind my head here. And that's where the cold water jacket will cool the spirit back into liquid, and it flows out into the buckets like so. Now, as the distillation comes out, the very first stuff that comes out is what we call the heads. And this is the undrinkable spirit of the first part. It's basically acetone, acetaldehydes, and methanol coming out of the still. We save that spirit and we use it for cleaning around the distillery. And in fact, during this year of 2020 COVID, we were using that as hand sanitizer that we were giving to our local community, police, fire departments, hospitals, and such, for using as hand sanitizer. But it is not drinkable alcohol. We typically will use it for cleaning all of our pumps, our hoses, things like that. The second part of the distillate that comes out of the still then is the hearts, and that's the good stuff. That's what we use for making whiskey. In Scotland we call it new make, here we just call it the hearts. And that's a white liquor, rye liquor that comes out over the course of about 9 hours as we distill it. There's a small stream of liquor that's coming off, and every 5 minutes we'll walk over, we'll take a taste, and we'll adjust the cooling system to make sure that it stays very fine and very nice coming off the still. Delicious. So for a full 9 hours, we're cooking that rye mash in that pot, and there's amazing changes that are happening to it, much in the same way that tomato sauce is changing from a bright acidic thing into something rich and caramelized. We see the same changes in the rye mash as it's cooking in that pot. And we're taking advantage of that to develop richer flavors over the course of that distillation than would have been captured if we were simply using a column type still alone, which is the most common type of still for most American whiskey. So dedication to the pot still process, apart from being a very adamant part of our traditional adherence, is also a very important part of the flavor that we're getting, the richness of the flavor that we're getting in that spirit. Now, at the end of the distillation, once all of the spirit has been captured that can be captured, we start to get bitterness coming through. And that bitterness is what we call the tails. It's basically fusel oils and things like that that don't taste good, that have a very pungent odor. They are reminiscent of mold or mildew. It's not very pleasant. And so we don't want that in the whiskey. So we will cut the tails and separate them out from the whiskey so that the best stuff goes into the barrel. Now, the tails are still about 50% ethanol, and we don't want to waste ethanol. We never waste ethanol. So what do? Well, we can take those tails and we can put them back into barley, the smaller still, and we can redistill them. And in doing so, we can separate those fusel oils down to that second distillation and recover about 90% of the ethanol that would have been lost otherwise. That ethanol has very little flavor because all the flavor came out during the whiskey run on the first time in the big still named Ron. And so what do we do with it? Well, we need to add some flavor. So what we can do is we can macerate in some juniper, coriander, cinnamon, anise, orange peel. You get the idea. What we're making here is gin. We'll basically make a compound gin by macerating these herbs in there and then redistill it in the pot still, which gives us rather an old world style, if you will, an old Tom style gin that we produce from the very whiskey, from the very rye that we use to make the whiskey. So the gin is truly a byproduct of the whiskey production, and here in the U.S. it's quite a popular part of our portfolio. Once the whiskey is made, it's time to fill the barrels. And here we have barrels just ready for filling. These are brand new. They've been stenciled with our logo on it, the state of Virginia on the side here. And they are set up here. We will first fill them with hot boiling water, actually the water running from the still, to make sure that they are completely watertight, rather than find whiskey leaking out of them, which would be tragic. And then we'll fill them right up. These will get filled, and then we'll take them out to where we age our whiskey out in the county, where it will sit for 2 to 4 years, exposed to that wonderful Virginia climate. We have the 3 flags prominently displayed in the distillery. Of course, in the center, our great American flag. On the left-hand side, we have the state of Virginia flag with the words Sic Semper Tyrannis, which means thus always to tyrants. I think that's a brief nod to maybe King George. On the right-hand side, this rather complicated-looking flag is in fact the flag of Loudoun County, the county where we come from here. The little black spiders are supposed to represent grains of wheat or rye, and the little white droplets are supposed to represent milk. So agriculture being the most important part of the county, it was grain and it was milk in this county for many, many, many years. Once the whiskey is aged and we've decided what proof we want it to be, then it's time to bottle. And behind us here we have our bottling stations. So we have a small turntable and the filling machine in the back there, where we can basically fill up the bottles of whiskey. They run through the conveyor here where they get the heat shrink capsules on, collecting on the table, at which point they're bottled. I think Rachel is bottling peach brandy presently, one of our local treats here. It's a quieter time in the distillery because we're in the holiday period, so a little bit less busyness happening than what would normally be happening. But this is where all the bottling would happen. 1 or 2 people being able to run that bottling station pretty effectively. And then once it's bottled, we stack it up into finished goods like this and ship it off wherever it needs to go. Being towards the end of the year, we're getting quite low on finished goods, obviously. It was a busy season, and we'll gear it all back up in January and get it all back going again for another fresh new year of whiskey. I hope you've enjoyed this tour today. I'm finishing up here in the tasting room. In better times, pre-COVID, this would be a very busy, busy place, and we're hoping to get back to there again soon. I hope all of you are staying healthy during these crazy periods that we're living through, and we all get back to some normal semblance of life. I hope you've enjoyed our tour of Catoctin Creek, this lovely little distillery that Becky and I started so many years ago. We hope to be here for a long time to come, producing this wonderful Virginia Rye Whisky for you guys to taste and enjoy. And hopefully you'll be able to start seeing it showing up more readily in London and places around the UK as we start to get going. I wish you all a very happy Rye January. And if you have any questions beyond this video, you are welcome to reach out to us here at Catoctin Creek or our partners in London at 1410. Cheers and God bless.